today. This is a meeting to help support folks that are interested in applying for the unsheltered Nofo, which has also been called the Supplemental Nofo this year. It's a new opportunity for our community that we're excited to share with you. I am Katie Haverly. I am the Acting Executive Director of Everyone Home here in Alameda County. And we really welcome all of you today to learn more about this interesting, exciting funding opportunity. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Rachel.
Thanks so much, Katie, and welcome everyone. We're really glad you could join us here. We'll just keep introducing our team here, and then we'll talk a little bit about what we're going to be covering today. So as Katie mentioned, she's the Acting Executive Director of Everyone Home, and I'm also with Everyone Home. I'm a data and performance analyst working closely on this process. We also have Dorcas Chang, our operations manager, here supporting us, and I'll turn it over to Kate to introduce herself briefly.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Bristol. I'm the consultant providing technical support to the continuum of care application this year. And I ended up getting to work on 2 applications. So I'm helping with what we're calling the regular and as well as this supplemental unsheltered Nofo. And happy to be here to share some more about that process.
Thanks so much, Kate. And then in terms of what we're going to be covering today, we're doing our welcome and introductions, and then we're going to give an overview of what the unsheltered Nofo is all about. That's going to include things like its purpose, what some allowable project types are, and allowable costs. Kate will be going over that. Then we're going to go over the local process of the local application process. So we'll talk about the reviewing and ranking process. We'll talk about a plan that's part of this application, and then we'll talk about some existing plans and materials, kind of to give you a sense of the existing system if you're less familiar. And then finally, we'll do a walkthrough of the application form. And I'll just mention right away that all these materials are going to be available on Everyone Home's website. They're not up yet. They'll be posted this afternoon after the bidders conference. And before we get into our introductions of who's here, we'll have a chance to do that in a moment, but we just wanted to mention some other groups that are involved in this process. So there is a Nofo Committee that has been meeting for both the regular Nofo, the usual annual Nofo, as well as this supplemental Nofo that we're talking about today. And the members were approved by the HUD COC committee. This is a non-conflicted group, meaning that they are not working for an agency that is funded by the COC, and they sign a conflict of interest agreement. We have a number of people who have lived expertise of homelessness who are part of the Nofo committee, and they are responsible for a number of things, including reviewing and ranking applications. So the local applications that we're talking about. We've got a number of our Nofo committee members here and really appreciate their time that they volunteer for this process. We also wanted to mention that there's another group involved in this supplemental Nofo for addressing unsheltered homelessness. There's a work group. We've got about 6 folks who have lived expertise of homelessness, and they are helping, meeting a couple times over the next couple of months, and they're providing input on a plan that's required as part of this application, and Kate will cover that a little bit later, and they'll have an opportunity to sign a letter of support of the final plan. So now we can do introductions for everyone who's here, because it's a large group. If you could introduce yourself in the chat, you could include your name, pronouns, and organization if you'd like. I'm also going to launch a little poll that asks a couple questions about whether you're planning to apply for a project under the supplemental Nofo and what type of project you're planning to apply for, just so we have a sense of who's here. So I'm going to launch that now. And then you can introduce yourselves in the chat and respond to the poll. While you're doing that, I'll just talk about a couple of logistics, is that there will be a time for question and answers towards the end of our time, and we'll pause a couple times throughout to ask for questions. It's possible, depending on how many questions, we might not be able to get to everything here, but we will follow up with FAQs. And if you have a question that's very specific to your project type, we might need to follow up individually. So, but we welcome questions in the chat. You can also use the raise hand feature in Zoom. And thanks so much for introducing yourselves here. So I'll give it a moment for you to respond to the poll and whatnot. Okay, and not everyone has responded to the poll, which is fine, but I'm going to just go ahead and end it here so that everyone can have a sense of who is here. So it looks like quite a few people are still deciding if this is an opportunity that you are thinking about applying for. We have about 5 people who are planning to apply. And then in terms of type of project, not everyone replied here, which is totally fine, but looks like a number of folks thinking about permanent supportive housing, and then a mix of the other types, including a couple of supported services only projects. So I will turn it over now to Kate to give an overview about this notice of funding opportunity.
Great, thank you, Rachel. So I will, oh, there I am. Now I see myself. So which means hopefully you can see me. We do have a pretty long deck, you can see, and there's a lot of information to show. As Rachel mentioned, we're going to try and ask if folks could mostly hold their questions to the end so we can have a pretty, hopefully lengthy Q&A session at the end. I will pause in between some of these sections of slides just to see if anyone has a question that you really feel urgently you'd like to ask as we go along. But if you could mostly hold on to them to the end, we'd appreciate it. So this first part, I'm just going to kind of give an overview of this funding source and how it can be used. So as Rachel mentioned, HUD is calling this a supplemental Nofo. And so typically every year HUD puts out a notice of funding opportunity for a continuum of care funds that is a regularly occurring annual process. And this year they've added this additional funding opportunity. So we've started referring to the thing people are most familiar with as the regular Nofo, and this other one is the supplemental. The supplemental one actually has 2 components. One is the unsheltered homelessness set aside, and one is the rural homelessness set aside. The rural homelessness set aside, Alameda County is not eligible to apply for because we don't meet the rural definition, but we are eligible to apply for the unsheltered homelessness set aside. And the purpose of that bucket of funding is to target efforts to reduce unsheltered homelessness, particularly in communities that have high levels of unsheltered homelessness. So HUD is really making an effort, in addition to the regular dollars they put out, to put out these additional dollars specifically to help communities create new projects that will address the needs of people who are unsheltered. Next. So the national pot of money is $267 million, and HUD has assigned every continuum of care a maximum amount they can apply for. So the Alameda County continuum of care can apply for up to 15 million spread over 3 years. So that comes out to $5 million a year. However, just because every COC has an allocation doesn't mean every COC is going to get funded. It's going to be nationally competitive. So while we will submit an application for $15 million, there's no guarantee it will be funded. And an additional challenge for communities in California is that HUD has adopted a policy around geographic diversity, which is that they won't award more than 10 grants in any one state. So that means California COCs, there'll only be 10 California COCs that receive grants. And since we have a lot of COCs and we have a lot of the people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness are in California, it's a little bit of a disadvantage to California. But this is the rule they've set up. Next slide. So if you're familiar with the regular, and I'm using air quotes, Nofo, you'll notice that there are a lot of similarities between that process and this new supplemental unsheltered process. So like in the regular Nofo, there's a local competition to score and rank all applications. Applicants have to fill out a local application that is scored. And then in addition, you also have to fill out a HUD application through their portal, which is called eSnaps, which I'll talk about a little more later on. And then all the projects get rolled together by the Continuum of Care collaborative applicant, which is the county HCD department, and submitted to HUD along with an overall consolidated application. And then the competition is between the continuums of cares at the national level, not the individual projects. So, you know, there's getting funding means you have to submit an overall package that aligns with all the HUD requirements, and in addition has a plan attached to it to address unsheltered homelessness. That is a good plan. Okay, the next. So there are some differences in this unsheltered Nofo and the regular Nofo. So in the regular one, you can only apply for 1 year of funding generally. In this one, projects can apply for 3 years of funding. And if awarded, you would get a contract with HUD for 3 years. You can only apply for things that are new, meaning if you have an existing continuum of care funded project, you can't renew it through this source. You can renew it through the regular process. Projects have to address unsheltered homelessness because it's the unsheltered Nofo. And then a couple other details that are different, and we will talk more about this as we get later into the presentation. But under this supplemental Nofo, if you want to do a permanent housing project, you can do that, but you can't apply for acquisition, rehab, or new construction dollars, which is different than under the regular Nofo. And then the other thing that's different, which is in addition, is that you can apply for street outreach and what HUD calls standalone support services only projects, which you cannot do under the regular. So this means you can apply to do projects that provide services to people who are unsheltered, not connected to housing. So you can just provide services and you don't have to propose a housing project, which you essentially have to do if you want to get new funding through the regular Nofo. Next slide.
And Kate, before we go to the next slide, I just wanted to clarify something that's been coming up in the chat. Just to be clear, this is the bidders conference only for the supplemental Nofo, so only for the Nofo for the to address unsheltered homelessness. And so we already had a regular, we had a bidders conference last week for the regular Nofo, and the recording from that is posted on Everyone Home's website. We'll throw that in the chat, as well as all of the application materials and instructions you can find if you're doing a renewal or a new project for the typical annual process. So today we're not going to be covering that process. Just want to make sure that was clear.
Yeah, and I would say, in addition to everything Rachel said, if you are wanting to renew your existing grant, all the application materials are also on the website. And we really won't be covering anything relating to renewals. So I would encourage folks to just go over there and look at the materials on the regular Nofo side.
And that application is coming up, just to flag one more thing, on August 30th for the local application.
Yeah, the local application deadline for renewals is the 30th. Okay, so one kind of feature of this supplemental Nofo is that the continuum of care has to write a plan for serving individuals and families experiencing homelessness who have severe service needs, and that is the name that HUD gives the plan. So that's their language. It's a 15-page narrative that HUD will score up to 70 points, which is a big chunk of the scoring for this application we'll be submitting. It has some very specific technical requirements and has to be organized in a particular way. But one of the kind of interesting and I think important features about this, and this is kind of a new thing for HUD to require, is it has to have a letter of support from a working group of people experiencing homelessness who are meaningfully involved in the COC decision-making process and who are supporting the priorities outlined in the application and the projects. So in order to get this plan written and submitted, the Continuum of Care has convened a work group. And that group has had its first meeting, and I just wanted to see.
Arlene is here.
Okay. I just wanted to invite Arlene, who is one of the group members, who offered to just give us a super quick update on the first meeting of the work group. And so that everyone can kind of have a sense of what that group is working on.
Thank you. I couldn't unmute myself. Good afternoon, everyone. This was our first assembling of a work group, and it was really a very interesting meeting. The thoughts that came out of it, and so I'm going to begin quickly. And one of the things that really struck me was the terminology that's used by HUD, unsheltered and homelessness. What does it mean? And it sounds so very technical and doesn't sound personal at all to anybody in the group that's been homeless or is homeless. And so it says, what key needs are of people who are unsheltered? First of all, we talked about homelessness being very traumatizing and how it can cause significant health, mental health and physical health issues. We need more mental health services along with pay incentives for mental health clinicians in underserved communities who are BIPOC. People need housing, but they also need supportive services, including after they are housed, in order to recover and reintegrate and to build a better quality of life. Many people need a transitional place before they go to housing, not to go directly to housing, because sometimes people are not equipped for that yet, just from the trauma alone. One of the other things that came up in this conversation is that housing is really important, but it's also essential to help people with immediate needs, especially those who are in encampments and unsheltered. They need hygiene, they need showers, they need laundry, they need phones, they need clothing, but they need clean clothing as well. We also talked about the debris removal and pest management at encampments, because hygiene is really important. We talked about the substance use and treatment services, better substance use and treatment services, peer counseling and navigation teams for peer outreach workers to go into encampments and locations and other locations and can be compensated without their housing or benefits being impacted. One of the other things that was really interesting, people who work at night, who could work at night when unsheltered people are awake, because you want to really hit your target population. Hub zones covering north, south, east, and west of each city that could be staffed with attorney, social worker, case manager, maybe perhaps a therapist, and only on certain designated days will be helpful, because people need to know where to go for help, along with help in getting to and from appointments. The other thing is the need for transparency and better technical centralization of agencies' data for better collaboration and a quicker response for services. We also need more communication in terms of resources by city, and we need transparency in how the funds are spent. And that pretty much summarizes what we discussed in this work group. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Arlene, and we really appreciate you coming and speaking with this group. And just to clarify some questions in the chat, there's not a letter of support needed for individual applications, but it's for the plan, which is going to go in the plan that's developed by the Continuum of Care in the consolidated application. And we really appreciate Arlene being willing to share from this first meeting, because we wanted you to have a sense of kind of what topics were coming up A little bit later into this process, we're going to be sharing a summary of feedback from this work group of people with lived expertise that might be able to inform some of your local application. This process is happening parallel. We're working to develop the plan with this work group at the same time that you'll be developing your applications. And so it's a little bit of an iterative process to make sure that you're getting their feedback and input. And I'll turn it back to Kate.
Thanks, Rachel. You just said exactly what I was going to say, which is thank you to Arlene very much. And just to let folks know who are considering doing applications that we will talk a little bit later in this presentation about how the flow of the application development for individual projects will align with the flow of the development of the plan and the work of the work group, and where there'll be an opportunity for applicants to sort of get a preview of what that plan is going to look like and integrate that into your thinking as you develop your proposals. Okay, next slide. So this is HUD's scoring. This is not the local application scoring, just to give you an idea of how HUD will evaluate our package once we send it to them. So HUD will score the application on a 100-point scale. And as you see, 70 of those points are going to be based on this plan that we're developing. There's another 4 points for sort of making sure that we did a local process that was clearly and transparently communicated, and that included objective rating factors. There's 18 points that are based on overall system performance. So the performance of the overall system and some data that the continuum of care provides to HUD. And then there's 8 points based on the extent to which the COC is coordinating and engaging stakeholders from other systems. So HUD will score that on a 100-point scale. And then in addition, they're allocating up to 30 points to each continuum of care based on the 2019 point in time count of unsheltered homelessness. So this is a way that HUD is giving an advantage to communities that have a larger number of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. So based on our PIT from 2019, Alameda County COC can get 20 out of 30 possible points. So the maximum we could score is 120. Some communities are going to be able to get up to 130 because they had a larger 2019 PIT count. So just so everyone knows that we're starting a little bit down in terms of points, but other communities actually can't even get the 20 points. So it's actually pretty decent that we're able to get 20 out of 30 on that factor. Next slide. So just this just kind of summarizes, obviously we can't predict whether this application will be funded by HUD. We do have some strengths in Alameda County, including the population of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness is unfortunately large and growing. Not that that's a good thing, but that it, as I just shared, the resources are going to be targeted to communities that have a more growing population of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. We also have some advantages in terms of governance and inclusion of people with lived expertise in the governance structure. And then some of the structural disadvantages we have, again, as I mentioned, California is at a little bit of a disadvantage because of the geographic diversity constraints. And then we don't know yet how our system performance will match up against other COCs. And like a lot of places, the performance measures have not all been trending in the right direction, partly because of COVID. So what we can control is we're going to develop a really strong plan, engage people with lived expertise in decision-making about the plan, and then prioritizing equity, which we'll talk about a little bit more as we get into the local competition pieces. Okay, so I think the next section, I think that was the last slide here. So I'm going to move on to talking about how we're going to run the local competition, but let me just pause and see, Rachel, are there any other questions you feel like it's important to answer here at this point?
Doesn't look like it. I think we can keep rolling.
Okay, sounds good. Okay. So, oh, actually, I'm going to turn this over to Rachel to do this first part.
Great, perfect. So for those of you who are a little less familiar with this process, with the regular Nofo as well, there's a process to get strategic direction from the continuum of care, from certain committees within the continuum of care. And so both the HUD COC and the leadership board for Alameda's continuum of care provided some strategic direction for the supplemental notice of funding opportunity. Again, these aren't specific application requirements yet. We'll definitely be covering those, but we wanted to give you some of the big picture direction that was provided from the continuum of care. And so the first couple of here align with HUD's guidelines for this opportunity to solicit applications for projects that will reduce unsheltered homelessness and improve health and housing outcomes for people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And there was some direction to particularly prioritize projects that support people who are living in encampments. And then number 2 is to address high service needs. Again, this aligns with the instructions from HUD to prioritize projects that address the needs of individuals and families who might have high or complex service needs. The third piece of direction was to center racial equity. So that involves identifying and reducing barriers in the application process itself and the operation of the proposed projects for organizations that haven't accessed continuum of care funds, especially organizations that are led by individuals who are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And so you'll see, maybe compared to the regular Nofo, we try to make this process a little bit more streamlined. There's still a lot of HUD requirements that come into the application, but that was one part of this process. The direction was also to prioritize projects that demonstrate how they will advance racial equity, such as by addressing barriers that contribute to disparities and or by providing training to staff. And then we've got 3 more, another piece of guidance around engaging people with lived expertise. So that means prioritizing projects that demonstrate how they engage people who have lived expertise with homelessness in decision-making, and you'll see an application question related to this. And then some guidance around project selection, basically directing to balance local priorities with how HUD is assigning points to make sure that the overall package is competitive. And so that includes prioritizing projects that have a long-term housing component, but also inviting applications for supportive services only, because that is an option with this supplemental Nofo. And so the projects that are being invited to apply need to either directly provide housing and or services or be a coordinated entry project. There are 2 other possible types of projects, but the direction was not to have HMIS or planning projects. That doesn't apply to many people here. Then the last piece of direction was around system-wide coordination, which was to prioritize projects that focus on system-wide coordination and in areas with high populations of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, so meaning areas of the county. And so you'll see when we get into the application, kind of how these pieces of strategic direction have been incorporated by the Nofo Committee into the scoring and into the application form itself. There's also some guiding principles that were established back in 2013 and reconfirmed in 2021, some guiding principles by the Alameda Continuum of Care. I'm not going to read them all here, but one piece is to maximize resources available to the community. So this supplemental Nofo is an opportunity to bring in new funding. So this is a way to maximize resources if it's awarded. Also, one of the guiding principles is to facilitate a clear, fair, and transparent local process. So those are 2 pieces I wanted to highlight. All right, so I'm turning it back over to Kate to talk about the review and ranking process.
Great, and I saw we have one question in the chat about what applications go to who. So as with the regular Nofo, on the supplemental Nofo side, if you're interested in applying, the first thing you're going to do is submit your local application to Everyone Home on behalf of the Continuum of Care. And that is going to be locally ranked and that by the Nofo Committee, which will decide which applications are actually going into the package. But in addition to that, there is a HUD online application that you have to complete through HUD's website, which we will also talk about. And that happens a little bit later, but also required. Someone, I actually do have a dog that barks, but that's not my dog. So if whoever has the barking dog could mute, that would be great. The HUD application does not factor into the local rating and ranking process. So what you put in the HUD portal doesn't impact whether the ranking and scoring of your local application, but you do have to do that part of it. And I'll explain the sequencing of that and some of the details about that a little later on. So I hope that answers the question from Eric. Okay, so we're going to talk right now about the local rating and ranking process, which is the most important part of the process. The Nofo Committee has adopted a review and ranking process document. It's kind of the policy document that governs how the rating and ranking will work. It describes the roles and decision-making authority of each committee, meaning both the COC Leadership Board and the Nofo Committee and the appeals panel, and actually the work group that we talked about. It describes the process for review and scoring of applications and the appeals process, and you can download that from the website. It is a little bit different than the review and ranking process on the regular side, and I'm going to share on the next slide a little bit about the differences. So as with the regular Nofo, the Nofo Committee will review and score all the applications that come in. In the regular process, the committee has to look at renewals and new projects. For this Nofo, of course, all the projects are new. And there's no tiers or reallocation. So if you're familiar with that other process, you don't have to, it's simplified because there's no tier 1 and tier 2. There's no existing projects that you might be taking dollars away from. So what's going to happen on this supplemental Nofo side is the committee will rank the projects by their score, and up until we reach $15 million. It's possible that whatever group of projects are selected to be funding might not perfectly add up to $15 million. So the Nofo Committee might ask a project or more than one project to submit a revised application with a smaller budget so that we can hit 15 million. We can't submit something bigger than $15 million in the package. So for example, if there were 4 projects that the committee wanted to move forward and each one was 4 million, that would be 16 million. They would probably have to go back to one of them and ask them to reduce their ask down to 3 million so that it could add up to 15. And then there's some additional ways the committee can reorder the projects based on priorities identified in the plan as informed by feedback from the work group, and then to achieve competitive advantage in the overall package as HUD will be scoring it. Next slide. Okay, so then I just wanted to pause a minute here to let everyone know what eSnaps is. This is the HUD online grant submission and management portal for the COC funding. So everyone that's applying for the supplemental Nofo, in addition to submitting your local application, you need to submit your project through eSnaps. It's separate from the local application. It does not impact the local rating and ranking. If you've never used eSnaps, we've provided a couple of resources here. There's a whole HUD webpage explaining how you get into the site, how you set up an account, how you set up users if you're going to have more than one user for your organization, how you set up a project. And in addition, we are offering a TA session next week for an hour from 10 to 11. If you've never used eSnaps, we'll do a kind of a live walkthrough of how the site works. And you can sign up for that on the Everyone Home webpage. The last thing I'll just say about eSnaps is when you set up your project and submit it, it does not go to HUD. It goes to the collaborative applicant, which is Alameda County HCD. And they're sort of the holder of all of these online applications until the overall package gets sent to HUD. So the reason we're asking you to do the eSnaps application even if you don't yet know, you won't yet know whether your application is going to be included in the package, is we have to get them all teed up, and it's a somewhat cumbersome process of getting them into eSNAP. So we can't really wait until the very end to have people doing that step. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here is an overview of the dates for this funding opportunity, the local dates and HUD's dates. So as I think I mentioned at the beginning, this Nofo came out June 22nd. We've been working on getting all the process steps sorted out. And so this bidders conference is today, August 23rd. You can come on August 31st to the eSNAP's technical assistance session. The local application deadline, which is the local application, which we'll be covering in just a few minutes, is due to everyone home by email on September 20th. And then you need to submit your eSNAP's application to the collaborative applicant by September 27th. The rating and ranking panel is meeting on October 4th, and you'll get your notification of the results of that on October 5th. Then there'll be an appeals process. If anyone submits an appeal, those will be handled between October 6th and 12th. And then the whole package gets sent to HUD by the collaborative applicant on October 20th. Or hopefully we'll send it a day before that, but it's due on October 20th. Next slide. And so here's just some basic important information. The first place to go if you have questions is the Everyone Home webpage, which has the application, the instructions for the application, all the related materials for the supplemental Nofo, and additionally for the regular Nofo. It's all on the same page. If you have questions, please email them to info@everyonehome.org. We will be writing out FAQs and posting them on the site continuously throughout the application period. And depending on the flow of questions, that might be weekly, it might be more frequently if we're getting a lot of questions. The last day we'll post FAQs is the 17th. So that'll close 3 days before the deadline, just so we make sure everyone, everybody who's completing applications has all the same information available to them. Local application packages will be due to Everyone Home September 20th by 5 p.m. also sent to info@. And then the eSNAP's applications, like I said, are due on the 27th, and those questions should be sent to HCD, Riley Wilkerson. He may end up forwarding those questions to me, so you may hear back from me. And as I said, we're having a TA session on eSNAPs to hopefully answer some of your general questions. Trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to say about this. Oh, just on the FAQs, if your question is very, very unique to the project you're working on, we will just send you an answer that's specific to your question. Any question you ask that is potentially generally applicable to other applicants will get written up in this publicly posted FAQ and posted for everyone, so that it's not just the person who asked it who gets the answer, but everybody can get the answer. Okay. I think that's the end of that section.
Kate, we had a question about when the local plan was going to be released, which I can answer. So unfortunately, the local plan needs to incorporate which projects have been selected. So the full plan can't be released before the local application deadline. But as it gets closer, we'll be releasing some preliminary aspects of the plan. And today we're going to be going over recent planning efforts in the community that are also going to help inform the plan that's included in this application. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Kate.
No, I would say we don't have a firm date when we'll be releasing the kind of preliminary elements of the plan, but it will be publicly posted and we will notify folks that it's available to take a look at. But again, as Rachel said, we can't, the way the HUD requirements are set up, it creates a little bit of a chicken and egg problem in that the plan is supposed to inform how people craft their applications, but the plan is also supposed to talk about the applications that have been submitted. So it's a little circular. So, but we will make some information available to you all on sort of the sort of preliminary thinking that's going into the plan.
And I just want to clarify another question from Ronnie. So you're not seeing the application instructions for the supplemental Nofo yet on the website. We're going to post them right after this meeting. So you'll see them later this afternoon, and we'll send out an email that they're up. But if you're checking the website now, they're not there. And then a question about eSNAP's application. Is it due 5 p.m. on 9/27? Someone wanted to know.
You know, I don't think we put a time. So I would say we'll make a decision about that and post that in the FAQs. It'll probably be 5. Okay.
All right, I think we can keep going.
All right. So now we're going to get into a little bit more detail about what you can apply for. And a lot of this is sort of shaped by what HUD allows, and some of it is locally shaped, but mostly it's sort of these are HUD requirements. Okay, next slide. So eligible applicants for COC funding it's pretty broad. If you're a nonprofit organization, a state, any entity of local government, a public housing authority, and somewhat recently HUD has added tribes and tribal entities as eligible applicants. Any of these kinds of organizations can apply for funding. And if you're a nonprofit organization, they will require, and you're new, they will require you to show you have 501c3 status. Next slide. So eligible participants, so in other words, who can you serve in your project? The focus is for the unsheltered Nofo is people who are unsheltered. And then HUD has some further definitions about that tie back to the official HUD homeless definition categories. So there's 4 categories in the HUD definition. And for these grants under the unsheltered Nofo, you have to serve people in category 1, which is what HUD calls literally homeless, which includes people who are staying in a place not meant for human habitation, which is any kind of an outdoor location, any kind of a vehicle, abandoned buildings, any kind of places that really aren't intended to be housing. You can also serve people who are staying in emergency shelter, and you can serve people exiting institutions after a stay of 90 days or less, as long as they were experiencing homelessness when they entered. And then category 4 is people fleeing domestic violence. So the categories not included, which are eligible for some kinds of projects under regular COC Nofo funding, are all the at-risk categories. So people who might be housed but at risk of losing their housing are not eligible under this Nofo. Next slide. All right. Now, with HUD COC funding, the HUD is very specific about the types of projects that can be funded, and they all are pretty detailed out in HUD's regulations. So you have to submit a project that fits one of these project types in order to be funded through this Nofo. And so this is the list, and then I have a slide for each one. So I'm going to run through a little bit of detail on each project type. The project types that can be funded are permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, joint transitional housing and rapid rehousing, and then support services only, which are projects that only provide services and do not provide housing, so only services. And those include coordinated entry projects, street outreach projects, and then any other kind of services project, which HUD calls a standalone SSO. And then a very non-exhaustive list here of examples would be something like a landlord recruitment project, housing search services project, an employment project. But again, services not connected to housing. Next slide. Things you cannot fund with this funding source include emergency shelter or transitional housing, homelessness prevention, and then this has been a little bit of a question mark as we've been going forward. We're still trying to get 100% confirmation from HUD, but things like laundry showers and storage facilities don't actually fit any of the project types unless they're connected to a housing project. So sort of standalone projects providing these kinds of facilities don't really fit the support services only category, unfortunately. And then, as I mentioned earlier, if you're proposing permanent supportive housing, you cannot propose acquisition, rehab, or new construction. Okay, so I have just one slide on each type just to give a quick overview. And as well, when we post the materials this afternoon, there's a lot of links to where you can find additional information on the different HUD project types. So permanent supportive housing is housing with support services and tenancies that are not time limited. They can be site-based or scattered site. And the housing can be secured through rental assistance or through leasing, or you could propose something in units you already own. Participants have to meet the categories I just talked about. And for this project type, you folks have to have a qualifying disability. A little different than the regular Nofo. Under this Nofo, they do not have to meet the definition of chronic homelessness. And you can apply for HUD dollars for rental assistance, leasing, operations of the housing, support services, your own HMIS costs, so your costs of participating in HMIS, and some administrative funding.
All right, so I'll be back here.
All right.
This, what you doing, Megan?
Okay, next slide. So rapid rehousing is a different housing project type, which is time limited, tenant-based rental assistance and support services limited to 24 months. Rental assistance, as HUD defines it, is when tenant-based rental assistance, as HUD defines it, is when tenants or participants find their own unit or are assisted to find a unit in the private market, and then the project sponsor, the tenant pays a portion of their income for rent, and then the sponsor pays the balance of the rent directly to the owner of the unit. In rapid rehousing, you have to provide housing search services and housing stabilization services. So you have to help people find their unit, and you have to help them stay in their unit and develop a plan for them to take over 100% of the rent when the subsidy ends. And the only kinds of HUD dollars you can apply for under this project type are rental assistance and support services, and your HMIS and admin costs. Okay, next one. The joint transitional and rapid rehousing component is a combination of a transitional housing project where the participants in the transitional housing can then get a rapid rehousing subsidy when they leave. The transitional housing portion can be site-based or scattered site. If you do one of these projects, you have to offer participants an opportunity to be in the transitional and the rapid rehousing, but they don't have to take advantage of both. They can pick one or the other. And under this one, you can ask for HUD dollars to lease or operate the transitional housing. You can ask for HUD dollars for the rental assistance for the rapid rehousing component, and you can ask for services, HMIS, and admin dollars. Okay. All right, so the SSO component, I wanted to spend a little more time on because it's been a while since anyone has been able to apply for one of these as a new project, because it hasn't been allowed under the regular Nofo for a very long time. SSO projects provide services to families and individuals who are experiencing homelessness, and you can do coordinated entry activities, street outreach or mobile outreach, and then, as I mentioned, standalone services that are not connected to housing. So if you are applying for this kind of a grant, you must be providing services to the participants. You can't also be providing housing to them. And there's a sort of fairly limited number of things you can apply for in terms of budget. So mostly what you can apply for is the costs of the services. You can apply for leasing only of the facility that you'll be using to deliver the support services. So if you needed to lease an office space to deliver services, if you're, for example, doing an outreach program, that's an eligible cost, but pretty much you're limited to services. And then the next slide shows the defined list of services that HUD allows, and the citation in the regs if you want to look up the details. But it's a pretty specific list, and it kind of explicitly says if it's not listed, it's not eligible. But you can do case management, childcare, education, employment. You can pay for food, mental health and health services, outreach, transportation, and deposits. But there's a whole list here. Okay,
And we just put a link to the chat, a link in the chat to these regulations on supportive services, and you'll see it in the application form too, because we know there's a lot of questions around this. There was a question about safe parking and whether that could be eligible or not.
Yeah, this is a little bit of a gray area, and I know when HUD did their webinar on this funding source, it got asked several times and they didn't answer, and I've also submitted a question which they have not answered. I think providing services, like if you wanted to have case managers who are providing services to people in a safe parking program, I think that would be eligible under the support services. The issue is with the safe parking is there's no way to pay for the costs of operating your, like if you were paying to the cost associated with the actual parking site, I'm not sure would be eligible. So that would be the issue. And you couldn't pay for like the operations of the site. So like security or any of those kinds of things. So it's a little bit of a gray area, and we're doing our best to try and get an answer to the question.
And then there's another question about transportation is listed here, and someone was hoping for a few examples of what that might look like.
That might be if you wanted to give well, actually, that's a good question. We might have to look up the answer as far as whether, I don't think you could use it to purchase vehicles, but I think what they're talking about is if you wanted to give bus passes or other kinds of transportation subsidies to participants, you could do that. And I'm not sure what else would fall under that. We would probably have to, we'll have to look that up and get an answer for you.
Jesus also asked about repair work of a vehicle and safe parking, and I think we'll add that to that.
Yeah, we'll have to add that to the FAQ.
Search. And then we had a couple of questions just more generally about whether a supplemental award can be renewed. Someone was thinking about a 24-month RAD rehousing relative to a 3-year period of performance.
Right, that's a really good question. So HUD has not said anything about what will happen at the end of the 3 years. Generally, what they've done with other kinds of special NOFOs, like for example, the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, is once the initial term of the grants end, you have an opportunity to start doing annual renewals through the regular process. So that's a possibility that at the end of the 3 years, you'd be able to roll into the regular NOFO and just renew your grant, but we don't know for sure what they're going to do.
And then there was also a question about back on Housing Project, if there was any limitations on rooms or units. For example, they have rental units with 2 bedrooms or 3 bedrooms at different locations. They wanted to know if there was limits on that.
No, you should just plan to make sure that the units are the right configuration for the population you're proposing to serve. So if you're going to be serving households with children, or you want to make sure you're going to have big enough units. If you're proposing to serve single individuals, you want to think about whether, it's cost effective to have people in large units, or if you're going to have them share. So just like as part of your local application, there's a place to talk about how the housing you're proposing is, a right fit for what the population is that you're going to be serving.
Okay, I think that's it for now. We got another question related to safe parking. So all of those questions around transportation, safe parking will follow up.
Yeah, so then I just wanted to mention a couple last important HUD requirements. One is you have to come up with a match equal to 25% of the HUD funding requested minus the leasing. So HUD always makes everything extra complicated. You need to figure out all the dollars you're asking for HUD to provide. And then you multiply that by 0.25, and that's the amount of match you need to come up with. It can be cash or in kind. And just bear in mind this other really important thing about match is you can't take all your costs that are ineligible and call that the match. So any costs that you are paying for with match also have to be things that HUD would pay for. So it has to be spent on eligible costs and to serve eligible project participants. So again, just be thoughtful about the match. It has to be a funding source that will pay for the same things that HUD would pay for. So you have to, it's a real match, or kind of it's a match requirement that's fairly, it's not very squishy. It's pretty specific. And then the last thing I just wanted to mention was about expanding existing projects. I think that's here. So on the regular Nofo side, if you already have a COC grant and you want to apply to expand it, you can do that. And then what HUD does is if you're awarded the expansion, you have the option of just combining it with your existing grant. Please bear in mind, you can't do that with these supplemental funds because it's a separate pot of money and you're going to get a 3-year award. So you can certainly submit a proposal saying, I have this existing COC project, I'm proposing this new project, it's going to expand the project I have. But administratively, you won't be able to combine them until probably quite a bit further down the road when the 3 years is over. And then if you're just thinking about these dollars as a way of expanding upon or building off of an existing project that you have, whatever it is, whether it has COC dollars or doesn't have COC dollars, a couple things to bear in mind is that HUD dollars cannot supplant dollars you already have from another public source. So if you're, please don't try to apply to just have HUD money take out something you're already paying for. If you have an existing housing project, the folks who are already housed are not eligible participants because they don't meet the definition of homelessness. And then remember that anyone who comes into your project has to, if it's a housing project, they'll be referred through coordinated entry. Okay, I think that is that part.
And we do have a couple of questions here back on supportive services only. Sharon asked, can you provide street outreach to people in encampments and then transfer clients to another program for transitional housing?
Yes, so you could apply to do street outreach, and then I think as part of doing that outreach, connecting to people to whatever other resources are available to them. It's certainly something you can do as part of the outreach program. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. And you'll see in the local application too, there'll be a time to for you to speak to how you're going to be connecting people to permanent housing ultimately, or on a pathway to permanent housing. So just wanted to note that. And then there's a couple of questions about the match. So one person asked about in-kind services match and whether that is an option. I can answer that briefly, that yes, it is, but it's a high administrative burden to really document the details of that. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Kate.
No, I would say that, yeah, you can do what is considered a soft match or an in-kind match, where the instead of it being resources that flow into your organization and into the project, it's services provided by another organization and you count the value of it. And as Rachel mentioned, HUD makes it pretty challenging because you have to document it at a pretty high level of detail. But it is a possibility. And we can post in the FAQs some links to where there's more information about match and in-kind match.
And then there is a question about what if current sources of funding will end? You were mentioning the restriction on supplanting existing sources of funding, but what if it's going to end?
I think if it's going to end, you should look at the maintenance of effort section of the HUD regulations, and we can also put an answer to that in the FAQ. I don't know off the top of my head what it says about funding sources that are ending, or if it says anything.
Great, I think we can keep going for now, unless you wanted to pause and see if anyone else has questions on this.
I think we can keep going. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the local application and how the applications will be scored. So the Nofo Committee has met and approved a set of scoring criteria, or rating criteria and scoring factors. And that is a separate document that also will be posted or is already posted on the website. So these slides are just kind of a summary. There's more detail if you look at the document. So there are some threshold requirements that projects have to meet, which are not scored, but if you don't meet them, the project won't be eligible locally. And then there's a 100-point scoring system for the local application, in which there's 40 points for how your project addresses local and HUD priorities. There's 25 points around proposed project performance and your track record in demonstrating performance of a comparable project. There's 15 points around your budget, match, and cost effectiveness, and then 20 points around organizational capacity. And so we have a slide for each of these. And again, there's more detail in the scoring factors document, and there's more detail in the application itself. And we are going to do a quick walkthrough of the application also on this call. Okay, next slide. So these are the threshold requirements. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on these. Obviously, you have to be an eligible applicant. You have to propose an eligible project. You have to score a minimum of 60 points to be considered. You have to either participate in or agree to participate in HMIS and coordinated entry. You have to have the required match. You have to propose eligible participants will be served. And then there's some additional requirements about having a financial statement, certifying you'll comply with the equal access and non-discrimination requirements, and agree to monitoring, training, and TA from the COC lead. Next slide. So the local and HUD priorities section is probably the section that has the most differences from on the new project application on the regular Nofo, because it's incorporating the strategic direction that Rachel mentioned and also some of HUD's policy priorities. So for this section of the application, you're going to be writing narrative responses to a set of questions. And the 5 factors that those questions relate to are these. So the first factor is around how your project will reduce unsheltered homelessness. So you're going to be asked to talk about how you'll outreach, engage, and serve people who are unsheltered and have severe needs. You're going to be asked how the project contributes to a reduction in homelessness in Alameda County, which includes how your project will either provide housing or connect people on a pathway to housing. And then there's a question about how your project will contribute to addressing health and housing needs of people in encampments and reducing the number of people living in encampments. So that's 15 of the 40 points. Then there's a question about system-wide coordination, which is how the project will improve system-wide coordination and target areas of the county that have high numbers of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. In the next section of this presentation, we're going to do a quick overview of the overall system, just to kind of give you an orientation to what it is and how you can find information about it, so that you'll be in a position to answer the questions around system-wide coordination. Then there's some questions about how the project will ensure racial equity. There's questions about how you align to housing first principles. And then there's questions about how you incorporate people with lived experience in project design, evaluation, and decision-making. The second set of factors relate to project performance. And so since obviously you're proposing a project that doesn't yet exist, what we're asking is in the first part of this section, you're going to be asked to talk about your proposed performance outcomes that you will achieve, and then how you'll achieve them. And so there are some existing performance benchmarks that the Continuum of Care has adopted, like just as an example, this is just one of many. There are benchmarks for the rate at which people might leave your project and go to permanent housing if you're a rapid, or the rate at which, if you're a transitional housing project, people would leave your project and go to permanent housing. And there's benchmarks for all the different project types. So those are provided to you in the application form, and you can use that as a place to start in thinking about your project performance, but you could propose outcomes. One of the reasons we tried to make this a little more flexible than on the regular side is because people might be proposing projects that don't fit any of the established project types under the SSO standalone component. So if you're proposing some kind of a services project, and there isn't an existing set of local benchmarks, you can propose what you think you will achieve. This is going to be scored based on how impactful it sounds like the project is going to be. And then in 2B, you're going to be asked to provide examples of what you have accomplished in some kind of a comparable project. So a report that you've provided to a funder that shows performance outcomes. If you have COC funding, you'll be able to provide your annual performance report for a comparable project. If you don't have COC funding, you could provide a report from any other funding source. And then the last element of this is going to be around just showing that you have had high utilization of either beds or dollars in a comparable project. The third factor is around budget and cost effectiveness, and this will be up to 15 points. So we'll give you a format. There's a format in the application for your budget that aligns with HUD's budget categories. And the scoring will be looking at whether the costs seem adequate and cost effective given what you're proposing. 3B is an optional item. And this ties to some of HUD's policy priorities, which is they will award our overall application more points if there are projects that leverage specific kinds of mainstream resources. So if you have a housing project you're proposing and you can show some of the housing will be paid for by a source that is not the continuum of care or ESG to at least 50% of the units or the participants, you'll get an extra 5 points. And if you're proposing any kind of a project that leverages healthcare resources, up to 25% of the requested funding, you can get some extra points. And these have to be documented in the form of a letter of commitment or MOU. And then there's an item for track record of grant spending in a comparable project. And then the last set of factors is 20 points for organizational capacity, which include showing that you've had a recent audit with no findings. If you are not required to have an audit based on the size of your organization and the kinds of funding sources you have, you can provide a financial statement. You need to provide a narrative talking about your experience serving the proposed target population. And then some evidence of timely submission of funder reports and invoices. And then there's some questions about how you solicit and use feedback from program participants for quality assurance. Excuse me. I think that's the last slide on scoring. Is there anything else, Rachel?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions here. So someone was asking about how to show high utilization for comparable projects if their project is new. They're asking if it could be for someone else's. So no, it's basically the applicant needs to look to another project that you've worked on that's as comparable as possible. So if it's, it might be a little different than what you're proposing if you're proposing something new, but you just pick something as close to it as possible to show your track record of utilization. Anything you wanted to add to that, Kate?
No, I would agree. I think we were looking for applicant track record. And if you are proposing something you haven't done before, that's fine. But as Rachel said, then pick another project or program you've done that's as close as you can get and provide us some information about that.
So it won't be your track record for this particular project, but the applicant's track record overall. And then there is a question back a little bit about asking to clarify about outreach services. They're asking, and feel free, Eric, to chime in if I'm misunderstanding, but some confusion around emergency shelter placements are ineligible, but then how can you refer to other housing options like transitional housing?
So you can't apply to run an emergency shelter with this dollars, but if you're proposing to do an outreach program that will connect people into shelter, that's fine. You'll want to talk about how that would then ultimately help lead them to housing.
Okay. Yeah, that clarifies. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think, Arlene, you also asked about if it's a new project, how do you submit documentation? So for all of these pieces that ask for documentation, you would submit documentation for a comparable project that the organization has worked on in the past or currently is working on.
Right. And some of them are just also organizational materials. So like the audit or things like that are specific to your organization as opposed to a project. Okay. All right. So I think I'm going to hand it back to Rachel. So I know this is a long briefing. We're getting near the end. We did want to just take a minute to give a quick overview of some existing plans that are in place and some existing elements of the current response to unsheltered homelessness in the county. Just some context for you to be thinking about as you're thinking about your applications. And also we'll provide some links to additional resources. So I think Rachel's going to run through a background on some existing plans.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Kate. And this is again, because we can't provide you the plan specific to the supplemental Nofo yet, we wanted to give you some background in case you weren't familiar with other recent planning efforts. There's more details on the slides that I'm really going to go into. We'll also put these links in the chat, as well as they'll be available in the slides, and they're also available in the application form itself. So don't worry if you don't get all of these links right now. So the first thing that we wanted to highlight was just a couple of pieces from the point in time count, the 2022 point in time count, but you can find more. We're also going to put the link to learn more about the PIT count data. So just wanted to highlight that Fremont, Union City, and unincorporated county experienced the highest increases in unsheltered homelessness. Also saw between 2019 and 2022 a lot of increase in people experiencing homelessness who are living in their cars, and some areas of high need that were shared were employment assistance and workforce support. And then we also wanted to highlight that a large proportion of people who were surveyed indicated that they had physical and mental health disabilities, and that they might have significant needs in this area. And this is one area where our work group that Arlene reported out on really highlighted the trauma of experiencing homelessness and how that might contribute to this type of data. And then we put in here a couple of pieces of information from the Home Together Plan 2026, and we have another slide next. The link is in the chat here, but this part of this planning was some system modeling that estimated the number of housing solutions needed to address homelessness in Alameda County. So you can see that here. I won't go into great detail. We also just wanted to share some of the goals from the implementation plan for the Home Together Plan, which is a plan for Alameda County. And you can see here some of these goals around preventing disproportionate inflow. So that has to do with people experiencing homelessness, so that some goals around this are rapidly resolving episodes of homelessness so that they're very brief, and preventing returns to homelessness, which might apply a little bit more to these types of projects, making sure that people have the support services they need so that they wouldn't return to homelessness. And then the second goal here of connect people to needed resources. And there's a variety of points here that you can read on the slide. Some of the points to highlight are connecting transition age youth to rapid and supportive housing programs. And something that's come up in a number of different planning efforts is the idea to lower programmatic barriers to crisis services and other services, meaning reducing the requirements or hoops to jump through that people might experience to get the services that they need. Then the other goal of increased availability of housing, and one of the points here that might relate to the supplemental Nofo is developing housing for people who have high service needs, which is one of HUD's priorities as well. And then finally here, improving communication and coordination, using data to improve outcomes, and improving messaging and information about what's available. This is something that came up in the work group as well. So then we have some slides here that highlight from 3 different recent planning efforts. One is the Centering Racial Equity report, which we put in the chat here as well, which is centering racial equity in homeless system design. The second one is the Home Together plan that we've just been talking about. And then there's the plan specific for youth, which is called Youth Action Away Home. And I just wanted to highlight in particular some of the points from the Centering Racial Equity report. We also include links in the application form for you to reference. There's questions around racial equity as well in the application. So again, something that came up was lowering programmatic barriers and increasing autonomy and independence so that people can make choices about what services and housing they need. And then related to supportive services specifically, there were a number of things that came up in these reports. One I wanted to highlight from the Home Together plan was expanding street-based assistance, workforce development, and to answer, I believe it was Arlene's question, workforce development are services to help people get employed and stay employed, as well as crisis and behavioral care. And then again, around this theme of lowering programmatic barriers in the Youth Action Away Home, there are some goals around making sure that services are really flexible and rapidly deployable, and some needs that came up in that plan have to do with transportation and legal services, among others. And then related to housing, in the Centering Racial Equity report, there's a number of different recommendations, but one that's relevant to the supplemental Nofo is increasing permanent supportive housing options for people who have high service needs. There's also, I want to note, recommendations in that plan for types of subsidies that might work for people who have lower service needs. But just wanted to highlight that increasing permanent supportive housing as it relates to the supplemental Nofo. And then from the Home Together plan, making sure people are getting from street-based outreach to indoor locations. So there's a lot more in all these plans, that a ton of work the community has poured into these planning efforts, but we just wanted to highlight just a few things. And I'll turn it back over to Kate.
Great, thanks, Rachel. So kind of in parallel with what Rachel just shared about the existing plans that have already been adopted, we just want to share a quick overview of some countywide systems that are in place for people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. You'll see, and I mentioned briefly, there is one rating factor and one question in the application that asks you to talk about how your project will support overall regional coordination of the response to unsheltered homelessness. So if you're not proposing a project that's going to span the entire county, you can also just talk about how you're going to fit into and align to what's already in place. So we just have a couple slides, very brief overview of what the street health and coordinated entry programs are through the health department. And if you have additional questions about kind of the existing system and how it works, you're welcome to send those in to info@everyonehome, and we will start answering those in the FAQs. Just a quick overview of Healthcare for the Homeless, which is a countywide program funded by the federal government. It provides healthcare and case management services to people, particularly people who are unsheltered throughout the county, including primary care integrated with behavioral health at sites throughout the county, street health services across the 14 zones of the county, health services in shelter and at drop-in settings, dental, optical, and specialty care, and then overdose prevention and harm reduction. Next slide. And so those health teams operate through 14 zones, and there's actually a map here, and it's interactive, and you can click on it and kind of figure out what teams operate in your zone or zones. Next slide. And then in addition to that countywide outreach through Healthcare for the Homeless, the Healthcare Services Agency also does the coordinated entry process, which is an approach to coordination and management of system resources to make equity consistent decisions and connect people to interventions that will help in their homelessness, and particularly to housing programs that are available to them. So the coordinated entry system has access points where folks can get help with housing problem solving, which is kind of a light touch form of housing assistance. They can get assessed for placement into shelter or in a housing program, and they can get prioritized for other available resources. The CE system then refers and matches people to housing and homelessness programs, and there's a grievance process. So that is what coordinated entry is in a very quick nutshell. The CE process also has zones and contracted access points that are by geography. And this is a little bit of a small size font, but you can see there are access points for North County, Oakland, East County, Mid-County East, South County, and then there's the transition age youth access point. And then 211 is also a way people can get connected to coordinated entry if they would prefer to do so by phone. And again, like that was like super fast overview. There's a lot of information on the County Office of Homelessness Care and Coordination website, and we'll provide those links. The Everyone Home website also has information. And as I said, as you're working on your applications, if you're trying to understand the countywide system or think about overall countywide coordination, please feel free to send your questions, and we'll do our best to post FAQs that everybody can avail themselves of. Okay, next slide. Okay, so then the last part of this very long bidders conference is, I think Rachel's going to give us a quick look at the application form, and then we'll just wrap up and get to questions. Oh, sorry, here's a few more resources. And again, all these slides will be posted, and all these links you'll be able to click on in live.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Kate. So I'm going to share the application form here and walk through it. And just as a reminder, it's not yet posted on the website, but it will be later today. And we'll be sending out an email about that. But we wanted to walk you through it just so you have a sense about the application form itself. And I'm not going to go question by question, but I just want to give you a sense of these different tabs. So the main application form for the local application for your individual projects is an Excel tool that we have set up. And sorry, let me just adjust the spacing so that I can show it a little bit better. So there are tabs that go across the bottom here, and there are sections on each tab for you to fill out. And we've tried to make it as easy as possible by when you open this up, the cells that you need to fill out are highlighted in yellow. And as you go along, only the cells that you need to type into will you be able to click on and write in. So the rest of it is locked on our end so that you can just write in these sections. And some things have drop-down menus. So let me just show you really briefly here. So, you know, your project name. So I'm just making up my project, and you go along like that. And then there's a proposed project type. So there's a drop-down menu of the eligible project types. So let's say I'm applying for a street outreach supportive services only. There's a couple of questions that get grayed out. So because I have a supportive services only project, then it asks me this question. If I had a permanent housing project, then it's going to ask me a slightly different question. So all of that happens automatically as you're going through, but do start at the top of each tab so that it can do that formatting for you. So then you go through, and the application amount is the amount of COC funding that your project is applying for, and then the amount of match, which we talked about. You go along here, there's some space for project description. There are some links embedded to different reference materials. You can click on those directly in this Excel as well, and it will open up for you. So that is the first tab, which is kind of like a cover sheet and some basic information about your project. So then tab B are threshold criteria. So these are the minimum requirements that projects have to meet according to HUD and local priorities in order to be included in this overall package. So these are not scored, they're not given a point value, but if you have to answer yes to these to be able to move forward. So you'll see if you respond yes, it will highlight it green, just to let you know, kind of just highlight that for you. If you say no, it's going to highlight that red because it's a threshold question. So if you're answering no, the project is not eligible. You'll see some sections like this will be grayed out. So for instance, there's a threshold requirement that your application needs to get a minimum of 60 points. So there's nothing for you to answer here. So it just tells you here that's going to be scored by the Nofo committee. So then as you go along, you just answer those questions. So this tab is pretty easy, but important because you want to make sure that your project meets all of these requirements. So the next tab has most of the narrative questions, and this is a bulk of the point value for this application. So it's up to 40 points of the 100. And as you go through here, you'll be able to type in your responses into these boxes. It is set that you should be able to pull it down. Let's say your response is a little longer, you can pull it down. There's not official limits on these, but your answer should be concise, aim for 500 words or even less. Just one note about using an Excel tool like this, that is sections of it are locked. Depending on your version of Excel, you might not be able to do spell check in here. We would recommend that you might use a Word document and copy and paste over. And there's just a couple of tips here. So they're already set up these cells to wrap, meaning that things will fit in this box. But sometimes when you copy and paste, that changes, and you would just have to hit wrap text or wherever it is, depending on your version. So again, these are the questions. The boxes that are yellow means that you need to write a narrative there, and then there are links for reference for you. And all of these align with the scoring criteria that we've already talked about. So system-wide coordination, ensuring racial equity, making sure that you use a housing first model, incorporating people with lived experience. So those are the main narrative questions. And let me just check the chat here, see if there's anything that we need to answer. And someone was asking, if you're applying for more than one project, then do you need to do a different application? Yes. So if you were applying for more than one project, you would have to do more than one application. The application is per project. So on to tab D, this is project performance, and Kate has talked a little bit about this. This is where you have a chance to propose some performance outcomes that are specific to your project. And there's more flexibility here than if you've applied for a new project in the annual Nofo process, because there are some different types of projects that are eligible here. There is a reference tab. It's all the way, let's skip ahead to H. That gives you the local benchmarks that have been established by Alameda's continuum of care. So if you have a project that lines up with these, we recommend that you use these local benchmarks as your measurable outcomes, but you can come up with your own that apply to your project. And so that's where you put that. So it's the only box you need to fill in on this tab. These other ones explain the points that are given for your track record of performance and project utilization. And this explains again that you're going to want to submit reports from a similar project, or a project that is as similar as your organization has worked on before. And if you are already getting COC funding, you could use annual performance reports. For anyone else, you just submit annual reports from another type of funding source. And this kind of highlights what needs to be shown in those reports for everyone home staff and the Nofo committee to be able to score these sections. All right, so moving on to tab E, which is the budget and cost effectiveness section. So again, there's instructions kind of embedded in this Excel sheet, and there's detailed instructions about the budget. Everyone does need to fill out this table to give your line item budget, and the items listed here, like leasing, rental assistance, operations, supportive services, HMIS, again, that's cost of your project using HMIS, and then administration. These are the budget line items for HUD's approved categories. So it's limited here to allowable costs. But again, remember, your allowable costs depend on what project type you have. And then there's a space for you to provide some more details about each line item. You can either put it here in this box, or you can submit, if you have your own detailed budget, you could put it there. But either way, you still need to complete this table. So it's in that format. Then this next section is optional, but you'll get some additional points if you have either of these things. So for permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing projects, there's you'll indicate if you have a letter or a MOU committing housing from another funding source. Kate talked about that, so you either say yes or no. And then for any project type, you have a chance if you are going to submit a letter committing healthcare services that equal at least 25% of the funds being requested. Again, these are not threshold requirements, but they do earn the project some additional points if you have those. And then this section is about grant spending. So again, you're using, an organization, you use a different project that is somewhat comparable, and it talks about how much you were awarded in the last grant year and how much was spent, and this gives some calculations about grant spending. All right, and then tab 4, this is the last of the real sections, and then there's just some things about the attachments. So this is again, some of these will have you reference a comparable project, and some of them are just about the organization as a whole. So this is about organizational capacity. Fiscal management is about the organization as a whole. It asks you if you've had any of these things, and if you have, you need to explain it. So it would be like audit or monitoring findings from a HUD source. So if none of that applies to you, you would just answer no to those questions, and you don't have to write anything here. But you do need to submit either an annual independent audit, or if that's not required for your comparable for your organization, then just a financial statement. There is one more narrative here, which has to do with experience with the target population, and this is worth up to 8 points. And this is where you can describe, the project partner's experience working with the target population for your program. And then there's a question about timely reporting. So this is a chance to say, how many of reports for a comparable project did you submit on time? So there's just a couple of brief questions about that. And then finally, there's some questions about quality assurance. So if you regularly get feedback from participants, you would say yes here, and that gives you a point. And this one is set up to give you some preliminary scores. So if all of these apply to your organization and you're answering yes to them all, then you could have up to 4 points, and it will show that there. And don't worry about remembering which cells you need to fill out, because again, it's going to highlight it in yellow, and also they're the only ones you're going to be able to click on. And then finally here we have the list of attachments. All of these are mentioned throughout, but this is just a summary for you. And you're going to email your completed application Excel form with all of these attachments as PDFs. So you can send that as an email. And this just is a place for you to check off so that you know that you've submitted everything you need. And there's a space that you can type in if you want to include notes. For example, you're going to need to send in some documentation about using a housing first approach. And so you could include here in the notes kind of what pages the Everyone Home and the Nofo Committee should be looking at. The other one I just wanted to highlight, I don't think it comes up anywhere else, is that you need one letter of recommendation demonstrating the organization capacity and experience and managing projects. And then finally, I already covered this. This is just the reference tab that has those local benchmarks and the links to those plans that we've mentioned, as well as, again, the point in time count. So that's just a point of reference. Okay, so that was a lot. So let me pause for questions about the application form. I'll keep it open in case we need to go look back at a tab. So I see Kate's already addressed the question about trying to keep it concise, but there's not, you won't be penalized. And then Question from Sharon. I don't know, Kate, if you wanted to speak to this question.
I'm just wondering if you could clarify the question a little bit. You can use individual or private donations as your match. I don't know what you mean about going above 100%.
No, Sharon is still here if you want to provide some clarification about what you're asking.
Or you could type it in.
Yeah, either way. Maybe we're talking about the grant spending. So here, I mean, let's just make it up. This is just to show that you get 5 points if you spent 95% or more of the grant spending. This is for a comparable program.
Yeah, so for example, just to throw it out there, say you have another program that you operate and you have funds from CDBG, you would say my CDBG grant in this time period was $100,000 and I spent $100,000. So then you'd show that you'd spent 100% of it. Or you could show I got a grant from some funding source and I only spent 80% of it, you know, and then you would get fewer points for that. So this is really asking about track record and spending. Ideally, public funds, it's not limited to public funds. So I guess maybe that's what you're asking. If you had a foundation grant, you could show that you had spent that. And one of the reasons this is a question is HUD COC funding. Historically, in certain project types, it can be hard to spend all the dollars, particularly if you have rental assistance dollars. So sort of the COC is sort of its kind of overall direction in terms of wanting to fund projects is to make sure applicants are going to be able to spend all the money. So this question sort of asks you to show that you have a history of being able to do that with some funding source, a grant funding source. Okay, so I think we're almost at the end. I'm sure everyone's like, will this ever end? I think there's just 2 more slides. Why don't we just do the last little bit and then we can see if people have more questions. Okay, so the last thing we just wanted to do, and we've already shared this, but just sort of a reminder of the key dates you should be thinking about as you're getting ready to apply. If you'd like some TA around eSnaps, you can sign up for the orientation session on August 31st. And then you should be getting your local application together and submitted by September 20th at 5 p.m. by email. And then also getting your eSnaps application submitted by the 27th of September. And again, all the information you'll need and all the documents will be on the Everyone Home webpage. And I think that is the last slide. The last one is just the question slide. So we still have some time left. If folks want to either type more questions in the chat, or you're welcome to raise your hand and we can answer questions live. And if there's anything we can't answer, we'll follow up and post a response. And Ming is asking just to confirm, do eSnaps before notice? Yes. So you will not yet know if your local application is selected for funding before you have to go in and do your eSnaps application inside the HUD portal.
So feel free to, raise your hand or just unmute if you have a question. In addition, you can keep putting things in the chat too. We know that was a lot of information to absorb, so can appreciate it if you need a moment.
And if you did have something in the chat that we missed, feel free to, retype it, or you can just let us know if we missed your question. And we're trying to track them all, but it's possible we missed something.
Anything else about any pieces of this?
I see a question in the chat, a new project, can it be for services that had not been funded? It depends on, I'm wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on your question. So if you want to add services to get people document ready in an existing project, is it an existing housing project? In a shelter? I think we're going to have to follow up about whether you can do services to people who are in shelter, as opposed to services for folks who are unsheltered. So let us get an FAQ on that one. You generally can't pay for the operations of a shelter with this funding source, but the services provided in shelter, my gut is probably not eligible, but I'm not saying, I don't know for sure. So we'll have to get an answer for you. Okay. Other questions?
I did get one other question related to housing first in a private chat, but I didn't quite understand. So I'll just answer just generally. The section of the application about housing first is making sure that the project aligns with housing first principles, and some of those are the information about it is directly there in the application form. And so if you had any other questions about that, let us know.
I would also
see.
say, no, go ahead, Rachel.
Oh, so their question was there any kind of sample application form that they could use that aligns with housing first principles?
No, but we can post some resources around housing first and how to operationalize it. I would also say that the housing first guidelines that are listed are somewhat a little narrowly constructed around projects that provide housing. So if you're not quite sure how to address the housing first questions, if you're doing a support services only project, please send us a question to info@, and we'll post some information about that.
And I just wanted to give, a couple last little reminders that you can send questions to info@everyonehome.org, and we'll get you to the right person and follow up with you. And if it's a question that could apply to others, it will go into the FAQ, and that period is open through September 17th. Anything we missed, feel free to chime in if you had a chat that you feel like got missed. All right, looks like that's about it. Anything, Katie or Kate, that you wanted to say here at the end?
I'll hand it over to Katie.
Just thank you so much, everyone, for attending and, like Rachel said, digesting lots of information about this funding opportunity. We appreciate your interest in trying to help us bring these funds to our community. And so, please reach out if there's any questions or any other ways that we can support you during this process. And again, just thank you for being here. We wish you the best of luck in your applications and hope you all take good care.